Growing up on a farm in the 80s most often meant a somewhat isolated childhood. During the winter, there was the society of school, but come the warm months of spring, a farm boy would find himself in the position of being free labor working for his parents. Until you had a driver's license, you were more or less stranded in the country and at your parents' beck and call. I was 14 years old, living on a cattle farm in Kentucky. And the year was 1984. My closest neighbors were my two cousins, farm boys like myself, who lived within bike riding distance down the road. Unfortunately, town was more than a day's ride by bike, leaving us to devise our own amusements during the rare days of freedom that summer offered. Perry and Joel were my dad's sister's sons, and being almost exactly my age, were the only logical and convenient companions for any of my romps abroad. They were, of course, annoying and fought almost constantly, which left me as a constant referee and mediator between their ongoing verbal and sometimes physical combat. The only thing for us to do on those rare days without chores was to wander and explore whatever strange patches of woods or hidden cow ponds we could find. It was an early hot summer that year, and the entire world had taken on a deep green, which I can only describe as overpowering. Everywhere the leaves had taken on an emerald, mirrored in the grass and thick vines of ivy that wrapped around the trunks of oak and maple. The air was heavy and laden with latent humidity as we made our way through the woods behind my cousin's farmhouse. We had found our way through to a clearing, and eventually onto the vague remains of a path, which may have at one point had been a long driveway. Unsure of exactly how far out we had gone, I became aware that this was completely new territory. The fields had disappeared, and now we were wandering on land which by the heights of the trees I guessed to have been left ignored for some 10 years. "Whose land is this?" Joel said, taking a shot at a nearby squirrel with his .22, the loud crack sending an entire flock of small birds into flight overhead. "You know who owns this, dumbass," Perry said, rolling his eyes and tossing a rock into the woods where it bounced from a tree and into the underbrush. "Who?" Joel asked, stopping and staring at Perry with his eyes squinted in concentration as he tried to recall the lost information. "Remember that girl that Hal used to go out with?" Hal was my older brother, whom I had not seen going on a year as he worked for a company which laid gas lines and spent most of his time on the road. He had a bad reputation for hard drinking, fighting, and doing drugs, so even my parents were relieved when his rare visits ended. "Yeah, the one that disappeared," Joel seemed proud that he had remembered, and was smiling with a self-congratulatory joy. I knew the story well, as it had been brought up in almost every regular conversation for years. My brother Hal had dated Nadine Vince for the last 2 years of high school. She had been pretty, smart, and her family was loaded. Therefore, no one could understand what she saw in Hal. 2 weeks before graduation, Nadine disappeared and was never heard from again. Her family had packed up and left the area a few years later, and this was the land on which their old house had sat. Local gossip had it that Hal had gotten Nadine pregnant, and that in fact her parents had sent her away and told Hal she disappeared so that he could never have anything to do with his and her child. Hal had never spoke of the event and had left town himself only a few months after Nadine vanished. "Hey, I bet we can find the house if we look for it," Perry said, surveying the surrounding woods for any sign of the abandoned building. "It shouldn't be too hard to find." "Look there," Joel said, using the barrel of his rifle as a pointer. We followed an imaginary line from the side of the gun to a pile of brush a few yards down the path. Perry let out a hoot of excitement as he gave Perry a rare slap of approval on the shoulder, for there, barely visible behind the mound of vines and weeds, was the gray corner of a rusted mailbox. "Crap, that means this used to be a road," I said, trying to imagine small trails of gravel running up from the blacktop. "It was probably the only house out here," Perry theorized as he approached the letterbox and realized that it lay beside a vine-entangled gate attached to a long iron fence that lay almost visible in the bushes. The gate was chained and padlocked, but we easily scaled the fence and began tracking through the woods, following what appeared to be the scarce remnants of a walkway beneath the lichen and the moss on the ground. Fighting limbs and thorns the entire way, we eventually caught out our first glimpse of an enormous 2-story house lying buried in the woods. Trees had grown along the foundations, and all manner of plant growth had enshrouded what had once been a new and very expensive house. We marveled as we beheld the remains of a rusted swing set and treehouse to the side, while behind a fallen and rotted deck was the buried outline of a swimming pool. "Damn! They must have been rolling in money," Joel exclaimed as he stared in wonder at the expensive railings and ornate architecture of the porch. "Watch out for them hornets, guys," Perry said as he pointed to the grotesque nests which lined the lower gutters, swarmed with giant, buzzing creatures. "I wonder what it looks like inside." Joel was already walking up the decayed steps of the porch, holding his rifle ready. "Let's find out," Perry answered, pushing forward, laughing. The front door gave way, cracking and splitting as Joel kicked it with his booted heel. We pushed it open slowly and aimed to find exactly what we had expected, a huge, empty house. The floors were covered in mold and animal scat as ants and spiders scurried over every visible surface. I found myself overcome with a sense of sadness as I looked over the cracked plaster of the walls and the large curtains of hanging webs. I thought of a family so overcome with loss that they abandoned their dream home rather than stay and face the memory of their last loved one. Perry and Joel immediately set about exploring the kitchen, while my gaze was drawn as if by siren call to the stairs. The long staircase curved up along the wall from the side of the living room into a landing above where the bedrooms had probably been. Without thinking, I was already walking up the steps, carried by my curiosity as my eyes locked on a certain room on the very end of the upstairs hallway. The door was open, and I walked towards it like a sleepwalker, caught in the current of a dream's puzzle. Inside the room was completely dark and filled with the heavy smell of mildew and damp rock. There were outlines on the walls where there had once hung pictures and once been a bookcase. I froze with shock when I noticed far to the right, beside a window covered in dirty blinds, an antique girl's dresser still sitting against the peeled wallpaper. I approached it slowly and saw with dawning realization that I could see things in the impossibly clean surface of the mirror. The room reflected in the glass was not the room which I was standing in. The vision was of the room as it was, fresh, clean, and new. There was a bed covered in a soft lace-bordered comforter, setting to the left against bright blue walls. There was the bookcase covered in books and trophies from sporting events, beside a chest of drawers with pictures sitting on top. In the reflection, I could see the top of a jewelry box and bottles of perfume and hairspray running along the bottom length of the mirror's edge. I was looking through a window into the past and seeing the room as it had been 10 years previous. It was then I was shocked from my daze by Perry calling from downstairs that it was getting dark outside and it was time for us to head back. I looked back at the doorway only for a moment, but by the time I looked back into the mirror, the vision was gone. My eyes wide and my mouth dry with fear, I stumbled backwards and out of the room. We left the house and we began the long journey back, but I did not say a word about what I had seen in the upstairs room for fear of being made fun of by my cousins. However, not for a moment did I forget what I had seen in the mirror. "Ma, do you remember Nadine Vince?" I tried to sound casual and vaguely disinterested by my own question as my mother sipped iced tea at the dinner table. I stirred my peas into my gravy-soaked mashed potatoes as I waited for her response. "Well, surely I did. But I'm a little surprised that you do, Eugene. You were only just a small fellow when her and Hal were running together. Why do you ask?" "We found her house out in the woods, and I kind of remember her some. She was awful pretty." "Hell yeah, she was pretty," my father interjected with a mouthful of cornbread. "Pretty and rich, too. She was about the only girl Hal ever run after that was worth 2 spits in a dry well. Idiot." My father chewed his cornbread with thinly veiled contempt at my older brother's obviously poor life choices. "People say he killed her," I stated bluntly, and was put off by the reaction my comment received. I had anticipated nervous laughter, or even a stern reprimand for suggesting such a horrible thing, but I was shocked into uneasy dread and wonder by my parents' abrupt and extended silence. "Well, we don't know that," my mother finally said as her hands trembled slightly holding her glass. "I guess you're getting old enough to know these things, Eugene, and I will say that I did ask him." My father's face was grim and pale beneath the sun-darkened leather of his old farmer's face. "And," I said, barely above a whisper, "he denied it up and down, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I had suspicions. and I came down on him as hard as any father could in that situation. He was stumbling around the town drunk that night after the sheriff finally gave up searching. I found him up by the bowling alley shooting pool with those loser friends of his, and I dragged him out in the street. He tried to take a swing at me. I laid him out flat on the sidewalk. He was laying there rubbing his jaw and calling me every filthy word he knew. I said, "You know what happened to that girl, Hal, and you better tell me right now before the devil drags you down to hell." He just looked at me with more hate than I'd ever seen in a boy's eyes. He stood up and limped off down the street, and I never saw him again for 3 years. He showed up on Thanksgiving, and God forgive me, I let it go. I never asked him again, and I don't think now I ever will. I swear to you, son, that if I knew what it was I did wrong in raising that boy, I'd give almost anything to change it. "That's enough," my mother interjected as she dabbed tears away from her eyes with a napkin. "This is no talk for the dinner table. Eugene, if you're done eating, you can go watch some television." I did as I was told. As I sat in the front room, I could only think of the mirror, what I had seen on the other side of its glass. Days passed with agonizing slowness. I was possessed by the one singular thought of returning to that house in the woods to at least verify to myself what I had seen. With a list of duties around the farm long enough to keep me occupied for weeks, I began to formulate a plot to sneak off in the night alone. I knew that Joel and Perry would gladly accompany me, but I would have no way of explaining the reason behind my journey, and I knew deep in the core of my being that this was something that only involved me, as I was somehow linked to the events which had unfolded. As I crept from the house, armed only with a flashlight and hunting knife, I tried my hardest to remember any details I could about Nadine Vince. Through the foggy recollections of my mind's eye, I could assemble a vague portrait of a young, beautiful blonde girl my brother had dated so long ago. To me, she had seemed tall, but in fact she'd probably only been of medium height, and with long straight hair and pale blue eyes. Her face had been rounded and moon-shaped, but not large-featured in the least. Her expression had always been one of polite, cool interest. I remember that she had often given me drinks from her soda and shared the candy which she kept in her purse. This was as far as my recollection could take. It took me a half hour to find my way back to the path, and then, grateful for the clearing, brightly lit full moon, I began my journey into the woods. The trees were alive with the buzzing of 1,000 insects, and in the distance I could hear an owl hooting over the cries of coyotes, far away but unnerving. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness, so I saved my flashlight for the house, where I was most certain to need it. Excitement made the journey seem brief, and within what could have been minutes, I was climbing the fence and across what had been one time the front yard of the Vince family. Now, with the flashlight on, I carefully climbed the porch steps to where the front door waited half open, just as we had left it. Inside, there was only complete and utter blackness cut with the pale swaths of moonlight which crisscrossed spectral and dim over the wooden floors. Shining the beam of my flashlight across the abyss, I found the stairs. I carefully made my way up the soft creaking boards until once more I stood facing the bedroom. Without another minute's hesitation, I entered and once more beheld the mirror. In all my imaginings of what might unfold, I could not have been prepared for what I saw. The mirror was a bright window into a room that no longer existed. The curtains and wallpaper gave everything within the scene a glowing blue luminescence that it almost seemed to shine out from the surface of the glass, which seemed suspended in the emptiness that was the present. My arm dropped to my side, and the beam from the flashlight became a small disc at my feet as I beheld Nadine Vince seated on the other side of the glass, combing her long golden hair as if she were looking at her own reflection. I watched amazed as she carefully brushed back her hair over her ears and carefully attached small golden earrings. She seemed contented and oblivious to the presence of the dark other world in which I stood, the world that would be to her the future. I shook and trembled with cold fascination, then almost screamed out loud and ran when I heard her speak. "Hello, Eugene. I see you standing over there." She was still brushing her hair and still seemed to be viewing only herself. "Are you a peeping Tom?" She laughed slightly, and I realized that I could hear music I could not identify playing on the other side of the glass. "Come on over. There's no need to be shy." Despite the terror I felt, I was struck with the vision of Nadine's beauty. She was just as I remembered her, but seeing her in the light of summer while I stood in darkness somehow enhanced the shine of her hair and the clear paleness of her skin. Her lips were small and pink as she smiled, still not looking at me, and said, "I'm so glad that you came back, Eugene. I really wanted to talk to you." Her voice was a soft, kind Kentucky lilt that seemed to put all my fears at ease. "Why?" I asked, as I moved closer to the mirror until I stood directly in front of her. "Because I remember you, and you remember me. I need your help, Eugene. You've gone and grown up, while I'm still here in this room." "Are you in the past, Nadine?" I said, as the physics of what was happening began to make my head spin. "Not really, honey. I'm not really anywhere, I don't think. I guess where I really am is somewhere out in the woods where your brother left me." These last words she said with a cold, bitter edge, completely devoid of the kind softness she had used until then. "So he did do it." These words were not a question, but a hollow stated truth. "He killed you, didn't he?" "Yes, he did. And he buried me in the hills off the highway, Eugene." She still brushed her hair and spoke as if relating a particularly bad rumor to a friend. "Why would he do that?" "He was drunk and angry because I told him I might be pregnant. We got in a fight, and he shot me dead right there." So the stories were true all these years. I couldn't believe it. Or truthfully, I didn't want to believe it. "It's all right. I don't care about that anymore, Eugene. Now, I just want to go home." "But you are home," I said as tears began to well in my eyes. "No, Eugene, I am not. My family left me here. I want to go and be with them. Can you help me?" For the first time her gaze met mine, I was staring into the bright diamond-like shine of her wondrous eyes. "If I can," I answered, wiping the tears from my cheek with my bare arm. "Good. Just go over there to where my bed used to be, and you'll find the loose board." I did as she instructed, and shining the flashlight, I could indeed clearly see a board which wasn't sitting right amongst the others. I knelt and lifted it carefully and saw a small hiding spot, made for a miniature photo album. Taking it, I blew the dust from the front and cautiously opened the pink cover to reveal a number of pictures taken of Nadine and Hal. I had to keep it hidden for the first year we were together because my parents didn't approve of Hal. In the center, there was a lock of my hair beneath the plastic. "Eugene, I want you to find out where my parents are at, and send them that if you can. I think if it goes to them, then I can too." "Sure, Nadine," I struggled, so I attempted to think of something to say, some way to apologize for such a tragedy. "And one more thing. The next time you see Hal, I want you to give him the photo album." My blood ran cold as I looked over and saw a strange, emotionless void in her gaze. "To remember me by." As I watched the mirror darken, as if the sun had sank in Nadine's world. In a moment she was gone, and I was stumbling in terror through the darkness, nearly falling down the stairs. I ran through the woods, cut by thorns and slashed by limbs, until I was on my bike on the way home. "Mama," I said the next morning as she was doing the dishes after breakfast. "Yes, baby," she answered, not raising her eyes from her task. "Do you know where the Vinces moved?" She winced, as if stung by the subject which caused her so much pain. "Why, yes, I do, dear," she answered, her composure quickly recovered. "I kept in touch with them over the years at first, in case anything ever came up." "So you have their address?" "Yes, I do. It's right there in the book by the phone." "Why are you asking, Eugene?" "I was just wondering." I left it at that and bided my time until I got the address. Later that day, I put the lock of Nadine's hair in an envelope, stamped it, and sent it away the next time I was in town, with a feeling that I had somehow at least atoned a little for the crimes of the past. The only other thing for me to do was wait until I saw Hal again, which I hoped would be a long time away. Unfortunately, Hal showed up within a week. I had been out fishing with Perry and Joel, and it was only a little after dark when I arrived home to find the familiar sight of Hal's old faded red Ford pickup sitting in the driveway. I saw my mother as I entered the house, and she muttered, "Your brother's out on the back porch. You should go say hello." I nodded my consent and washed my hands before briefly going to my room and placing the photo album into the black back of my jeans. I walked to the porch, resolving within myself to give it to Hal, no matter what. He was sitting on the bench swing, with one arm stretched out with a cigarette pinched between his fingers, and the other holding the neck of a Jack Daniels bottle, positioned between his legs. He was dirty, and his clothes were patched and unraveling at the seams, as he flipped back his greasy blonde hair and stared at me half smiling. "Well, isn't it lean, mean Eugene?" He chuckled, and as usual I could not determine whether he spoke with kindness or mockery. However, he patted the cushion beside him as he swung, and reluctantly I sat down and endured as he mussed my hair and gave me an inebriated hug. Hal had never been a particularly good brother, but he had always been far from abusive. Even at his most wasted and belligerent, he had always found a joke or apology to throw my way. One of the hardest things about my experience with Nadine was that I truly loved my brother. "So what has been my little brother up to? Hope Paul's been working you to the bone all summer." He blew smoke from between his thin lips and smiled in earnest as the last rays of a distant sun disappeared in the distance. "Nah, it's been all right, but I gotta talk to you about something." I stared down at the porch and tried to formulate any way of breaching the subject without it ending in tragedy. "Wow, serious talk from my main man here. What's up, bro?" "It's about Nadine Vince." A dark cloud fell over the previous bright humor of his rough features as his green eyes darkened. "What about her, little brother?" "Well, me and Joel and Perry found the old Vince house out in the woods off of Route H. I can't believe they haven't torn that place down by now," he said distantly, as if the past was emerging unbidden and painful in the waves over his thoughts. "No, it's still there. We went inside, and I found something. No." I looked him directly in the eyes, determined to catch every flicker of emotion to transgress his demeanor. "And what would that be?" he said with a dead tone, as if every soul had suddenly been stricken cold and numb with hurt. I reached behind me and withdrew the small book, laid it carefully on his lap by the whiskey bottle. He stared at it as if it were the corpse of some dead animal I had laid on his leg. "I thought you might want to have it." He tossed the butt of the cigarette into the yard and lifted the album reverently before opening the cover and staring, as if in a trance, at the first picture. It was of him and Nadine standing arm in arm by his pickup truck in the parking lot of the high school. The truck was brand new and shining deep red then, and Hal was so handsome and young as to be unrecognizable as the person sitting beside me. Nadine was just as she had appeared to me in the dresser mirror. "God, she was beautiful," he whispered as he touched the photo, gently tracing lines of her chin with his dark-stained finger. "Hal, I said before, you've been thinking, did you really kill her?" He froze for a moment, as if time had stopped, and he dropped the album floorboards of the porch as he hand covered his face. I watched him carefully as he began to sob, and I knew that behind his long, thin hands he was weeping. Then, coughing to cover his tears, he wiped his face and took a long drink from the bottle. Looking off at the point where the sun had sank over the barn, he turned back to me with shining, bloodshot eyes. "Do you really know what happened?" he asked, his voice low and soft. "Yes," I answered, my voice trembling. "I did, Eugene. I shot him dead with a .38 revolver not 2 miles from that house." I looked at him with terror and awe, his face with a mask of sorrow and guilt. "Why, Hal? Why would you do that? It's not like you think. I know what everybody said and has been saying ever since, but none of that was ever true. The truth was something nobody would ever believe, because no one ever really knew Nadine, nobody but me. All they knew was that pretty face and that long golden hair. They knew how she smiled and laughed and always said the right thing. All they saw was her family and their money. They didn't see her. Nadine wasn't normal, Eugene. She was cold, manipulative. She didn't feel things the way other people do. No one ever saw the way she'd laugh when people got hurt, or the things she'd say. There was no one to mirror her. She was 17 years old, and in a few months she'd be old enough to inherit every dime her parents owned. She started out making jokes about how nice it would be if they died in a car accident and we could run off together. And then that day she got real serious and told me that if I really loved her, I'd kill her. And her little sister. She had a gun, .38, she bought off some hood in Chestnut. She said that I could make it look like a robbery, and then after all the papers were signed, we'd just take off together. We'd be free of this stinking town and everybody in it. I told her flat out that she was crazy. We got this huge fight. She said that if I wouldn't do it then, she'd find somebody who would. But that wasn't enough, because now I knew her plans. and that was when she pointed it at me. I watched her cock the hammer, I grabbed it, and she started fighting for it. We're both on the ground when it went off, and that was when I saw that look in those pretty blue eyes. I saw all the hate and evil inside her. As she bled out from her stomach, I tried to stop the bleeding, but she was gone, just like that. I knew no one would ever believe me, so I buried her out there in the woods. I never went back. I looked at Hal, and I saw the empty despair shining in the tears that ran unchecked down his face. He looked down at the photo album, picking it up, closed it, and his sorrow smiled. "That's really weird," he said, laughing to himself. "She used to keep a piece of my hair in this. I wonder what happened to it." He stood and went in the house and began talking to Mom about his job. We said no more about Nadine Vince. But the next day, the sheriff and the state police showed up on the porch of the farmhouse with a warrant for Hal's arrest. Nadine's parents had been found murdered in their home the day before. They had been stabbed to death with a hunting knife, found lying in the house. The same knife Hal had given me for my birthday 2 years ago. The same knife I had taken with me to the old Vince house a week before and lost, but in my state of panic, had not even noticed it was missing and forgotten. It had Hal's fingerprints all over it. They had also found long strands of blonde hair in the hands of Nadine's father that would be used as damning circumstantial evidence in the trial. Hal was convicted of murder and sentenced to death row. He denied any involvement in the crime right up until the end. After the verdict was passed, I walked once more deep in the woods with a container of gasoline, and I burned the old Vince house to the ground. It didn't matter, because even as I watched it burn, I still heard the sound of that girl's laughter over the cracking and breaking of the walls.